Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
So I'll start off by saying that this forum, unlike some other things you may have heard about today, is still free. So there's not going to ever be tuition.
Possibly too soon.
Too soon? Oh, I'm sorry. All right. So to self-introduce in the same way that the panel introduced, I was raised as a Christian. I became sort of a theist, sort of in the middle of my life, and then made the decision to become a Christian again later in life. But all throughout that, I was also developing this sort of career as a chemist, and so I'm in principle here to tell you, or I guess it's this discussion. So that's really what I think the main event here is: all of us discussing our different worldviews, and I'm here to sort of tell you some about my worldview. But I think I'm interested also in hearing about other worldviews, about how science and faith interact in terms of how we seek for truth. But before we have a discussion, there's one sort of primary misconception about how science and faith interact that I would like to lay to rest. And that's the perception that science and faith conflict mainly at the level of observable facts. That is the idea that maybe there's some master list of phenomena, things like the age of the universe, the origin of species, whether the Earth revolves around the sun or the sun around the Earth. And the whole conflict between science and faith is that that science and faith can't seem to agree on which set of facts are actually correct, how things actually happen. And unfortunately, this is not an accurate characterization either of science or faith, and in my particular point of view, Christian faith. Because Christian faith doesn't actually involve endorsing any particular creed of observations about the created universe. Rather, the role of faith is to help us figure out what to do with those observations. Likewise, science is more than just observable facts. As Henri Poincaré put it, he said, "Science is made of facts." The same way that houses are made of stones, so science is made of facts. But a pile of stones is not a house, and a collection of facts is not necessarily science. Because science isn't just the collection of facts about the physical world. Science is the business of interpreting those facts and giving them shape and meaning. And so in practice, although it's not popularly perceived this way, science and faith are both in the business of interpreting evidence. And so for a given phenomenon, science and faith will typically give two different explanations. Typically, those explanations coexist. Sometimes they exist in conflict with each other, or other times they cooperate with each other. And let me just give you one example of how this might work. So you might ask me, you might say, "Troy, why is your shirt purple?" And I could say, well, I could give a chemical explanation for that. I could say my shirt is purple because there's a high concentration of 6,6-dibromo-indigo in the fibers that were used to weave my shirt. And I could even provide a scientific justification for that by trying to soak my shirt in a particular solvent that would remove the dye and therefore show chemically the reason why my shirt is purple. So that's one explanation. Another explanation I could give for why my shirt is purple is I could say my shirt is purple because my wife thinks I look quite nice in purple. Two different explanations for the same phenomenon. They coexist, and they're both correct, but they don't conflict with each other because they're not exclusive. And the explanations of science and faith typically coexist in exactly this way. So we could ask a question like, why do bacteria have flagella? And one explanation for this would be bacteria have flagella because of an evolutionary process. First, the secretory system arose, which gave rise to a protoflagellar filament, which later evolved into the eubacterial flagellum that we know today. So that's one explanation. Another explanation for why bacteria have flagella is bacteria have flagella because God wanted them to be able to swim. Two competing explanations with different layers of meaning. And for me, these two twin tools of interpretation provide the most meaningful answers to the key question I have about the universe, which is, what about me? How do I fit into the universe? Because, of course, the universe revolves around me. But this is a question that science by itself is not very well equipped to answer, because at the outset, science defines truth as being objective. That is to say, truth is an object that exists independent of its observation by the subject, namely me. Thus, science divorces truth from the truth seeker. So, to paraphrase that, one of the most wonderful passages of Scripture is where Jesus tells his disciples, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." By contrast, the promise of modern science is the somewhat more mundane, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall probably not have any perceptible impact on the way that you choose to behave." Because truth is out there, and I am over here. So the scientific truth doesn't by itself have any way of influencing me and the way that I behave. But I need truth that has the power to change how I behave. And to help you understand why that's the case, I should admit to you that I am not perfect. Now, I know this is shocking to you because up to now you thought that I was perfect, but no, I'm not. And neither are any of my religious or scientific colleagues. We are all imperfect. And to my mind, this is the primary argument in favor of Christianity over and above any other framework of faith. Because Christianity gives us not just a means for deciding how we should act, it also provides us a means to act according to that framework. And the means of action is the person of Jesus Christ. Because as Christians, we're convinced that when we place our faith in Jesus, then the person of Christ comes to live in us. And fundamentally what I believe as a Christian is in Jesus' power to change me, to change who I am. And to help you understand why that's so central to me, I need to explain to you that in junior high and in high school, I was a geek. Now again, I know that's shocking to you. You're probably thinking, MIT chemistry professor, and in high school you were a geek? Get out of town! I never would have guessed that. But in fact, it's true. I was socially awkward, I was too smart for my own good, and to boot, I grew too quickly. So you can count on it that 6 months out of the year, my clothes were going to be too small for me. And the unfortunate truth is that chicks don't dig tall, scrawny, awkward dudes who don't know how to dress themselves. And so in the social structure of my high school, there were the popular kids, and then there were kids like me. And I was one of the uncool kids who desperately wanted to be cool. And it didn't make me a very nice person. You know, it encouraged me to shun all the people who I thought were lower on the social ladder than I was. You know, all the other people who didn't have enough money to buy all the right clothes, or all the other members of the chemistry Olympiad team who, in my opinion, were much nerdier than I was. And, life outside of high school didn't really turn out all that differently for me. I just found myself replacing popularity with any of a bunch of other ultimate goals. Good grades in school, getting into the right college, success in my career, making money. And none of those actually made me a very good person. Because the problem wasn't with the in-crowd or high school or academia. The problem is me, the way that I am, and the things that I want. And no matter how hard I work, no matter how much I try to engineer the system, that's not a problem I can solve because I am the problem. And theistic naturalism doesn't really provide me any help here, because if God merely set the universe in motion and then hung out a sign that said, "Be back in 25 billion years," then I'm stuck. Whatever I am is whatever I am. And likewise, most world religions are even less help on this point, because they tie our acceptance by God to our ability to accomplish a handful of tasks or live by a set of rules. It's only in Christianity takes a quite different point of view. It says, look, in Christianity, morality isn't a way for us to suck up to God. It's not a way for me to prove how much better I am than all the non-Christians out there. Because the whole story of Christianity isn't even one of people getting close to God. The story of Christianity is God drawing close to us and coming down to earth in the person of Jesus Christ. And so for me, this inherently Christian, but also inherently scientific worldview provides the most meaningful way to answer sort of the big questions in life. But I'm also looking forward to I'm most looking forward to the discussion, because all of the nuance and all of the sort of human points of view on this come together because of the just sort of manifold ways that we can interpret our life experience and the evidence and the things that we cherish in life. And to just illustrate for you the importance of different interpretations on things, I want to share an anecdote. So there was a father who went camping with his daughter. And when night fell, they made camp. And in the middle of the night, the father looked over at his daughter. And he woke up, he looked over at his daughter, and he saw that she was looking up at the sky. And he said, "Oh, sweetie, are you looking at the stars?" And she said, "Uh-huh. What does that tell you, Dad?" And the father decided to really impress his daughter, so he came up with a very good scientific interpretation for what this told her. He said, "Well, what that tells me is that by observing the dance of the astronomical bodies, we can see that every body in the universe obeys a universal law of gravitation." The daughter was not impressed. She merely said, "Mm-hmm." So the father decided to try again, this time with an engineering explanation. He said, "Well, by observing the inclination of that constellation relative to the horizon, I can see that it's about 3 o'clock in the morning." The daughter was still not impressed. The father was a bit crestfallen, decided to try one more time with a religious interpretation. He said, "Well, I can see that all of creation has been fine-tuned for the creation of life, that the entire universe was actually created specifically for the purpose so that you and I could live in it." The daughter was still not impressed, and she said, "Dad, you know what it tells me? It tells me somebody stole our tent." Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to some questions. The problem of suffering is certainly one that humankind has dealt with since probably the beginning of humankind, and I'll provide a few different bits of thought on that. So certainly it's not one that I have solved or that anyone has solved. So it's a question that we all wrestle with going through life and day to day. In terms of how this relates to Christianity for me, one of the things I put myself, since there was a time where I was not Christian and a time where I am, the thing that always strikes me about suffering as it relates to Christianity is, so the Christian viewpoint of saying, well, there's the difficulty of God being loving, and how could a loving God, and if he's powerful enough to stop it, how could he allow suffering? But then I also place myself in the point of view of the alternative, which is, well, what if, so then, the sort of nudge that pushes you towards is to say, well, maybe that means that there isn't a loving and all-powerful God out there. But then if we're left in that situation, then I'm left with the alternative of saying, well, then what do you say about suffering if there isn't a loving and all-powerful God out there? Because then I'm left with the point of view that the universe is completely ambivalent to human suffering. And I place a great deal of significance, when I'm encountering someone who's in pain or in turmoil, that there is some significance to what they're going through, and that there is this sort of human drive to say, well, why, and what is going on here? And a sort of philosophical response that says, well, it just sucks to be you, doesn't really jive very well with, my sort of human desire to say, well, there should be something there. I can't just give up the wrestling and saying, well, there's no purpose to suffering, it's random, there you go. And so in that sense, suffering does drive me towards the suspicion that God might exist. And in terms of the competition between being loving and powerful, I think that, at least in Christianity, suffering is one of the most powerful expressions of God's love, because in Christianity, God is a God who suffers with us. Because God isn't some far-off deity who just lives, and set the universe in motion and never came back. God is a God who came down to earth and suffered and ultimately died. And that in that suffering, God shares our suffering, so that when we hurt, God knows what it's like. And it's not some, condescending sympathy, but it's a real feeling of the same pain that we feel. And so that suffering is an illustration for us of just how much God can and does love us. And in terms of being all-powerful, there's then the question of, so he loves us, great, but then why does he still allow suffering to happen? And, I always have to remind myself that, it almost seems like a rhetorical question, right? Where you're like, well, of course he would stop it if he could. And I think the same thing sometimes, but then I have to remind myself that, I don't have all the data. As a scientist, I'm like, I can only see a limited amount of data from my perspective. I can see the past and the present, I can't see the future. I also can't see conditional things like, well, what would happen if this happened versus that? And I also, and there's also within most faith traditions, there's the idea that there is a spiritual world and a physical world, and we can see the physical world, but there's more to it than just what we can see. And so, that's saying, okay, I have to be careful about making pronouncements about when suffering is or is not justified. Not that I then can say, oh, well, it's all okay and I can explain it. But I do have to call myself into account sometimes when I start to put myself in God's position there. Is that sort of, do you have a follow-up?
No.
Okay. And I'll say that was one of my longer answers because it's a such a big question. I'll try to give shorter answers to some of the other questions so that I don't talk forever.
So I guess you talked a little bit about this in your introduction, but so how is the difference between why and how addressed in science, if it's addressed at all?
Right, so yeah, it does, I did address this some in my introduction, but I mean, I think there is a subtle difference, so the how I think is kind of obvious for science, like science sort of is there to answer how questions. It also does answer why questions. So I mean, if I drop something and you say, why did it fall? Well, I would say, it fell because of gravity. Gravity made it fall. Or if you say, well, why did this chemical reaction happen? I would say, well, the chemical reaction happened because it increased the entropy of the universe. The second law of thermodynamics. And those are whys, it's a very subtle kind of why, because what we're doing is we're really organizing things that we've seen happen many, many times in sort of a family of observations, and then we're ascribing purpose to that family. We're saying that because it belongs to this family, that was the cause, that was why this happened. So it's still something of a mechanistic why, but there is a sense of whyness to it, that you have an order to things and you can understand that. It's different than the why, why me, God, or why was I born, or why am I here? Those are sort of a different kind of purpose that you might ask. But yeah, does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, so then I guess my follow-up would be, does science ever address the idea of why am I here, or why me?
So I don't think science by itself ever answers why am I here or why me kinds of questions. I mean, that is to say that there are philosophical viewpoints that are built on science and rationalism, for example, that can address those kinds of things. But as far as I would define science, which is okay, I'm a chemist, so I'm sort of the working class scientist. I go into the lab, I make measurements, I write scientific papers. So I would use that as my definition of science. And so within that definition of science, no paper I've ever written answers the question of why am I here.
I have another follow-up question to that,
Yep.
just because I find it very interesting. Do you think that a scientist who goes into a scientific exploration without a question inherently as a human of why involved in it is doing more than could be produced by artificial intelligence, is capable of doing more?
So I think there is a key ingredient of science, which is the human inspiration piece of, as much as I'm supposed to set aside my biases for scientific inquiry, there's a reason that I address the questions that I choose to address. It's because of some curiosity or drive or suspicion or intuition or guess or something. I don't just go in there thinking, well, I have no idea how this is going to turn out. I'm just going to do it. It's more, I usually have a hunch or something like that. And I think that for the progress of science, in principle, it's possible that you could design, a computer that would run all the experiments and figure out all the results. But it's been very, it's been very difficult. There are very few fields of science right now where artificial intelligence can do as well as human intelligence at scientific question asking.
My next question would be, is it possible to be faithful and scientific at the same time?
So I think this, you can look at this from one of two sides. It's like, okay, well, is it harder for me to be scientific or is it harder for me to be faithful? Which one is the difficult piece? So I'll take it from one side, and if I pick the wrong one, then you can ask me to answer the other hand. So I'll presume that this is someone who has some sort of faith-held belief, but is asking whether they can hold that faith-held belief and still be scientific. And my answer is absolutely yes. So people have all kinds of faith-held beliefs, whether they're religious or not. And the point of being a scientist and being scientific about things isn't that you have no unscientific thoughts. It's that you're able to recognize the difference between scientific thoughts and not scientific thoughts. And when you're doing science, you set the unscientific thoughts aside. So if I get a really unusual result in the lab, I could write a paper that, and submit it to, Science or Nature that says this was a miracle. And that would be the title of the paper or something like that. That would be an unscientific conclusion to draw from the results. And I have to sort of set aside those types of things and say, okay, look, here is my scientific line of inquiry. Now, being faithful in that process, does that mean, okay, well, I just set it aside, it's completely irrelevant? I think the place where faith comes in is, and the answer to, I've forgotten your name now.
What's that? Mark.
Mark, and the answer to when I was answering Mark's question, I think that faith does come in terms of inspiration and application of ideas, going in with the idea that something is going to make sense. Even though you don't know in advance that it's going to make sense, you go in with some faith-held belief that, yeah, this is going to make sense in the end anyway. That is a bias, but it's one that's not deleterious to doing science.
Yeah, my follow-up question is going to be very similar to that. Do you believe that religion contributes unique insight to the realm of science? If so, how beneficial is religion to science?
Right. So you could clearly overstate the benefit of religion to science. Science does operate independently, but I think for me this idea that things are going to make sense is something that both historically and in my own personal experience contribute greatly to the benefit of science. When I say historically, one of the reasons the scientific method became popular, why should we think, for example, when we ask scientific questions, that things should make sense? It could be that it's all just nonsense. There's no way that you could ever make sense of the physical world. But people went into scientific endeavors because they were theists and Christians, and they believed that the universe was created by a rational God, and therefore the universe we created should make sense, and so we should study it and find out what he did. And that has turned out to a large extent to be true. The universe does make a lot of sense. And for me, in terms of how religion impacts science, it definitely does give me new ideas to study, and it does give me new significance to the things that I observe in terms of learning something about God through the creation that he has made.
Hi. My question relates to what you mentioned, like if you titled a paper, "This was a miracle," you would call that maybe unscientific. Mm-hmm. So relating to sort of things that can't be explained by our current understanding of science. My understanding from reading one of your interviews online is that you don't subscribe to a literal interpretation of Genesis. And my question was, do you subscribe to a literal interpretation of other things in the Bible, such as the virgin birth of Jesus? And so when you're reading the Bible, how do you decide what things to interpret literally or not?
Right, so I think I should emphasize that, one of the reasons that I start off by talking about interpretation is because I'm not up here to say, I think there's, we get off track in these kinds of discussions when someone gets up here and tries to say that, my interpretation of the Bible is the one that you have to take, and if you're not with me, you're against me kind of thing. I think that, the scriptures were given to us, for the seeking of truth, but by themselves as sort of a monolithic body, they aren't truth by themselves. They require interaction with human beings. In terms of how do I decide, I would say that, how do I, so when you get down to saying, how do I decide which ones, I wouldn't say that I think of, which pieces are true and which pieces are not true. But certainly there are passages of the Bible that would be described from a scientific point of view, or not from a scientific point of view, because scientifically there's no such thing as a miracle, but from a sort of simplest explanation point of view is miraculous, that I do believe happened. And it's not incongruous to me that there could be actual historical events that were miraculous described in the Bible, and other things that are poetical in the Bible, where it's like, okay, there's, and certainly there are passages in the Bible where it talks about trees clapping their hands. And I don't think they meant that the trees suddenly got, in that particular passage, the trees sprouted arms and started clapping their hands. That has a different meaning. That doesn't mean that other things that seem miraculous could not also have happened. It's about reading things in terms of the context of the Bible and understanding the whole story arc of what it's trying to say.
So I guess a follow-up to that would be, if there are some things that are described in the Bible that could be described as miraculous that you believe actually happened, do you believe that perhaps the time for miracles is past, or do you think miracles could still happen today?
I certainly think miracles can still happen today. So let me first of all, though, give a caveat of what I mean by miracle. So I think some folks would interpret miracle as meaning that the laws of nature have been violated. You know, that I tried to drop something and it didn't fall just because the law of gravity was suspended for, you know, an instant or something like that. That's a miracle. A miracle is not, I mean, miracles can exist where there is a physical mechanism that coexists. So, you know, if I take a biblical example, you know, there's the example of Moses parting the Red Sea. So there are ways that physically that could happen. There could be a big earthquake, there could have been a landslide, you know, there's different, you know, they're very improbable events, but they could happen. And the reason we still call that a miracle is because they're so improbable that someone would just walk up to the edge of a sea and say, part, and then it would just happen that there was an earthquake right then, and the sea parting was like, pretty improbable. So it's simpler to say that's a miracle. And it's to say that even though there's a physical explanation, there is another layer of interpretation there. It says beyond the physical mechanism, there was another mechanism working, because as, you know, a human being, I see that in that event. And as far as whether miracles like that can happen today, I would say that absolutely. So I can say from my own experience, my son, when he was 3 months old, was diagnosed with an incurable autoimmune condition. So the antibodies in his blood were recognizing his platelets and his red blood cells as pathogens and killing them, which was obviously not very good for him. And the doctors had to tell us when he was 3 months old that, you know, for as long as he lived, he was going to have this problem, and he was going to have blood transfusions and immune therapy and probably bone marrow transplant and various things, which was really hard for us to hear. And after he'd been on medication for a year, they weaned him off just to sort of suppress the symptoms. They weaned him off to see if he could do all right with it. And my son's 2 now, and he doesn't have the condition anymore. And they don't know why. They were like, well, he should still have this immune response, we don't know why. And I would characterize that as a miracle. Now, there may be some mechanistic explanation there where he's like the 1 in a million, well, he was like already the 1 in a million kid who got this condition. So then he's like a 1 in a trillion who got the condition and then managed to, you know, overcome it. But that seems pretty improbable. And even if they come up with a mechanistic explanation, I would say the fact that that did happen is miraculous to me, because it's important.
As a follow-up, I just wanted to ask about, do you believe that there are miracles that happen that don't have a mechanic explanation that can't happen?
I will say that they could be. You know, so God can do whatever he wants, and so he certainly could do that. But the other thing is, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between mechanistically impossible and just really, 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 really improbable.
So, do you think that modern miracles are what constitutes, I guess, in a scientific way of interpreting it, is some way that the quantum mechanical wave function just collapse on that one?
So that could be, you could say, look, quantum mechanics does provide a possibility for the apparently miraculous. I mean, I don't think that most miracles fall into the category of quantum mechanics, but it could be. Or you could say statistical mechanics. You know, the second law of thermodynamics only holds almost all the time. You know, it's 1 in 10 to the 23rd times it's violated.
So with us being sometimes sort of unsure of the nature of things that seem miraculous, wouldn't that suggest that we should be unsure of using miracles as like maybe a proof of God, or as a reason to believe in something?
Right. So my favorite quote about miracles was from Fyodor Dostoevsky, who said, he was a variety of Christian, and he said that, look, if you really don't believe, you can even disbelieve your own eyes if you want. Miracles, faith does not spring from miracles. Miracles spring from faith. And so it's not as if any miracle is ever going to, any particular instance actually should be the thing. You say, oh, we have enough miracles, therefore we believe. I think there is always the cart. That's putting the cart before the horse. So,
I think one of the questions that was asked by the Cooper community is a follow-up to that. It's sort of general to that, but you can take it more specifically, I think, if you like. But it asks, is a leap of faith scientific? So it seems related.
Yeah, so the wording of that is a bit ambiguous. So I'll say the way that I think of a leap of faith as being part of the scientific, or how it interacts with science, which is, I think there's another misconception about science, which is that if you do enough scientific investigation, that somehow eventually you become certain of something. You become sure that this is right. This is in fact not true of science. So that's true of math, You know, if you do a proof in mathematics, then you can, and you prove it, and you didn't make a mistake, then you're sure that it's right. You know, given these axioms, this is true. In science, it never works out that way. So you do any number of experiments, and some of the experiments are going to be in favor of your conclusion, and some of them are not going to be in favor. You know, it may be that 99.9% are in favor and only 0.1% are opposed, and you know, okay, well then you have to say, well, was there some variation in the 1.1% that opposed? But you know, there's always going to be some evidence that's hard to reconcile with your conclusion. Or even if there's not any evidence yet that contradicts your conclusion, there could be more evidence later that would eventually contradict your conclusion. And so in science, you can never be certain that you're right. You can be very confident, very, very confident, 99.44% confident, but not 100% sure. And so, but yet, in terms of how we make decisions, we have in our lives to make lots of either-or decisions. And those either-or decisions are certainty decisions. Like, okay, well, either I have to do this or I have to not do it. And I have to make that decision with some degree of certainty in order to be able to go to sleep at night after I make the decision. And in order to get to that level of certainty, that's where you have to make the leap of faith. Where it's like there's always a gap. Sometimes the gap is huge. You don't have very much information and it's a very important decision, but you've got to make it. Sometimes it's a very small gap, like you know, something related to gravity. Like if I try to drop something, will it fall? Well, I'm pretty sure it's going to fall. But there's always a gap there that is filled by a leap of faith.
You said that you were talking about how we're always unsure about science. Science historically has always been, its progress has always been, you know, models in the past that have been proved wrong or inaccurate in the future, and that's always how we improve on it. This is actually a question where, you know, some people compare God to be like folklore figures like Santa Claus, and that, you know, if children eventually stop believing in it because of, you know, whatever, they grow up and they say it otherwise, and their parents say otherwise. Why is it not the case that, you know, people stop believing in God?
Right. So there's this comparison of God to Santa Claus, or God to the Easter Bunny, or God to, you know, folkloric figures. You know, there's an interesting comparison you can make here. So, you know, if you take chemistry, which is my discipline, and you go back 400 years, you say, well, what was chemistry 400 years ago? Chemistry 400 years ago was alchemy, which is the field where people thought they could turn lead into gold. And you ask, well, what was alchemy 100 years before that? Alchemy 100 years before that was wizardry. It was people who thought they could obtain mystical powers by studying. And so chemists are wizards, are the modern day equivalent of wizards. But nobody believes in wizards. I mean, chemists are like wizards. And yet nobody believes in wizards. That doesn't mean chemists don't exist. It just means that there's some poor understanding of what chemistry is that you could have if you were sort of, if you hadn't really studied it very well. And if you have that poor understanding, then you have this sort of off-base picture of what chemistry would be wizardry. You'd be wearing Harry Potter robes and stuff. But then you say, okay, but now you realize that actually chemistry does exist and it's this field and you can do these things. And the relationship between God and folkloric figures is very similar. I mean, so Santa Claus but that actually happened in the opposite order. So for Santa Claus, God existed first, and Santa Claus is sort of an infantilization of God. But nonetheless, the fact that these sort of folkloric or mythological figures don't exist, and I would say that God does exist, there are similarities in terms of the attributes given to different mythological figures and so forth in God. But the fact that there are similarities between the two and one doesn't exist doesn't actually imply that the other one doesn't exist either.
So it's kind of like there's a saying that any sufficiently advanced form of technology is indistinguishable from magic. So I suppose it's kind of like that, where the mechanisms of how God deals with things is we can't. I mean, like Santa Claus, there's historical evidence or whatnot, how Santa Claus was originated, but you can't really say the same about that. So is that aspect? So there is some historical evidence for Christianity. It's not a slam dunk, and it's also historical evidence. So you can also question historical evidence, the validity of it, and so forth. But there's the resurrection of Christ and the sort of common observations of the early disciples that stuck with this observation even under persecution. But yeah, there is some historical evidence that suggests it's plausible and at least has some more credence than just a story somebody made up. So that does give me some confidence, because I certainly don't believe in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny.
But yeah, I mean, I think that, and the other thing to think about is that in Christianity, our understanding of God does change. No, I wouldn't say change, maybe improve. We learn more over time. So it's not as if I would think of any reasonable faith tradition as being a closed book in the sense of, oh, well, there we go, and I think that there is so there is evolution in terms of our understanding of God, and it could be that just for example, if I read some of the passages of Christianity in the Middle Ages, and I read some of the points of view about God and man and the relationship, I'm like, wow, that's a really primitive. I mean, I understand where they're coming from, but it's like our understanding has changed and shifted based on our historical experience of what God is like.
To respond to that, I definitely agree with you in that, often children have this father-like figure of God that's very loving and accepting, and then as they grow up and they encounter the real world and come across suffering, that view kind of changes and it shakes them up, and it often leads them to believe that, oh, okay, the view that I had of God is childish, I'm going to abandon it. But as you said, I would respond by saying, no, you just have to evolve your perception of God into the way that you're changing, because if you would leave religion as something that's very static, it's not going to advance as much as it can, and you're not going to gain from it as much as you can. So I guess my question is, how does that transformation from childhood into adulthood, in terms of religion progress, and how that takes into account? What kind of steps do you think are necessary in order to evolve religion personally?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that's important is to expose yourself to people with different viewpoints than your own, because that's because it's almost certain that even though I've thought about this a long time, I'm almost certain that I am at least in part wrong about God right now, and if I just sort of wall myself in with people who think exactly the same way that I do, when I discover that I'm partly wrong, then I'll say, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I'm partly wrong. I don't know, but when I'm exposed to, I'm sure that some of you guys know things about God that I don't know, or about faith or about science, and having discussions where you talk with people who have different backgrounds than you, I think helps you to better understand and be prepared for the fact that, okay, later on I'm going to discover ways that I was, short-sighted or incorrect or didn't really see the full picture. And it prepares you to have sort of the intellectual background and the firepower to say, okay, well, but now I understand what you were saying. Somebody told me that and I didn't understand at the time, but now I get it.
There is a book, it's possibly a book of theories by Benedict Spinoza. It's called Ethics. Mm-hmm. And yes, I'm quoting ethics, which is surprising. But he talks about God as something that lacks duration, and in the scope of human existence, the most infinitesimal part is just part of the plan, and God has no beginning or end, and quote, with no duration, as previously said. In relation to your own beliefs and your scientific practice, what do you think in regards to that?
Right, so Spinoza was a proponent of naturalism, sort of a view of God that was similar to what I said at the end, where God sort of set the universe in motion and then sort of doesn't touch it. And so, from Spinoza's point of view, you can learn something about God just because it's sort of like looking at his footprints. But other than that, there's not much you can learn. In Christianity, Spinoza's naturalist view of God is there's sort of this idea of Trinitarianism, where there's sort of three God in three persons. And Spinoza's naturalist view is closest to the Christian view of God the Father, the sort of creator of the universe, all-knowing, all-powerful, transcends time, all of those kinds of things. But in terms of the Christian tradition, equally important is the incarnation of God in Christ, where even though God is beyond time, he made himself subject to time in the person of Christ, where it's like, okay, he experienced time in order in the same way that we do, but God the Father does not. And there are also ways in which the Holy Spirit's action in the world is sort of like, okay, well, God is separate, this sort of naturalist part, but then the Holy Spirit is the connection between that God out there and the action of God in the world. So I think that the naturalist view is consistent with many of the Christian views about how God acts, but then there are some outside of naturalistic things that God has managed to do in creation in the Christian viewpoint.
I have a personal question that sort of adds to that. I think when you're talking about Jesus Christ in relationship to how we do things now, and our current understanding of that, or like his history's understanding of it. But like, I often feel that I've produced my best work when I work for myself, and I don't know if you feel that as a scientist ever, but how do you justify sort of self-interest in your work and the sort of deemed value of total self-sacrifice?
Yeah, so I don't know if I've done my best work when I've been self-interested or not, but I certainly would say in my experience that I don't feel the best about myself when I'm working for my self-interest. And so yeah, I wouldn't put myself out there as, okay, well, I'm always completely, and that's actually a challenge for me, that I've thought about, because, I do think that not being self-interested would be my ideal place. But then, you get back to this idea of, well, okay, so I should not, okay, well, I want to have a chocolate bar. Well, but I shouldn't be selfish, so I'm not going to have the chocolate bar. So then, but then wait, now I don't want to have the chocolate bar, so I'm still doing what I want to do because I decided I didn't want the chocolate bar. So how do I not want the things that I want? How can I, there's just no way around it. Like if I change my mind and make myself not want what I wanted before, it's still what I want now. And ultimately the only way out of that, from my viewpoint, is for me not to be me. For me to be someone else who is not wanting, so I have the will of another person. And that is the fundamental mind shift of Christianity, is that in accepting Christ we take on, we subject our will to God's will. We let God's will be our will in place of our own, because our will is not perfect. And in terms of how that interacts with my work, certainly there have been times, and I don't know if in a worldly sense this makes me do better work, but there certainly are times where I'll say, I'll be approaching a scientific endeavor and say, well, God, you know the answer to this question, or all the questions that I have. Can you just guide me to the right question to ask? And that whether or not that actually is helpful or not, in terms of whether it changed the outcome of what I would have gotten in research, I don't know. But it is certainly something that has helped me when I'm feeling like I'm becoming too self-focused and self-centered and seeking after my own gain.
You talked a little bit there about the connection between yourself and God.
Yes.
And also earlier you talked about the difference between the subjective self and the objective facts that you learn from science. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts regarding like consciousness, maybe our understanding of consciousness, the question of consciousness, and how that might relate to the question of science and faith, or to the question of how we might connect to God.
Right, so the question of consciousness is, if I was to phrase it in one way, is the idea, are we more than robots, or more than computers, or more than computers attached to robots? And certainly from a purely scientific perspective, I think it is difficult to say that human beings are much more than robots, or much more than computers. Because science provides mechanistic explanations, and you can provide the same mechanistic explanation for human beings doing something as a computer doing it or a robot doing it. But I have great difficulty actually then making the conclusion that human beings are robots, or that we're just computers. I just sort of have ingrained in me that there is something beyond the mechanistic explanation going on when my wife gives me a kiss or something like that. And it's actually, from a scientific perspective, I don't think that you can ever pin down something you say, well, here is where consciousness is. Because once you've done that, you've already given it a mechanistic explanation. You could then make a computer that would do exactly the same thing, that I would say is probably still not conscious. And then you sort of say, well, okay, well, that's not really where consciousness is. You can sort of chase it into a corner, but you can't ever grasp it. But that doesn't mean that I don't think it exists.
Do you think maybe that idea, that concept you're kind of talking about of the inability to pinpoint maybe consciousness and the inability to kind of really understand, what our experience as humans is, in terms of how maybe we perceive God, etc., is evidence in itself for why, the fact that God exists?
Yes, so certainly some people use that as a strong bit of evidence that points towards something beyond us.
Right.
And then I would say that that is something, but at the same time you have to be careful with these things because you don't want to rely too much on things that science can't explain as evidence for God, because then God ends up being just in the gaps of what science can't explain. So I believe that God exists in the things science can explain and that can't explain, and in the things it can. But I think certainly the existence of my sort of strong feeling that there is a consciousness and a self, at least for me, I don't know, maybe the rest of you don't have a consciousness, but I do. That belief does push me towards believing the belief that there is a God who put that consciousness there.
With questions of consciousness and free will, if you, in one view, if you sort of don't accept that we have some supernatural consciousness, and if we're just robots, then it's sort of a bleak view of the universe and everything seems sort of deterministic. And that's unsettling to a lot of people. But how do we be careful to not choose a worldview just because it's satisfying to us?
Right, so I'll say that, I can say that I am careful on that because, there's an equally bleak Christian worldview, which is Calvinism. Which says that which also says there is no free will. That God knew everything that was going to happen before it was going to happen. He saw the end before the beginning. Everybody who's going to hell, He knew they were going to hell. He made them so that they wouldn't go to hell. It's like this very bleak worldview. But once you sort of go down the point of view of, well, God is all powerful and omniscient and so forth. So how would He have not known what was going to happen? Well, He probably did know what was going to happen. So that you get yourself down this philosophical trail where you're like, okay, well, then determinism must hold all the way down. And there are some folks who say it's determinism almost all the way down. There's just like a kernel of free will there at the bottom, but it's almost all determinism. I don't know exactly. I'm mostly Calvinist in my thinking about things. But I will say that even in a deterministic worldview, the escape is, well, the point is that, okay, well, if it's deterministic, it certainly seems like I have free will. Even if it's very determined in some complicated way, it seems like I have free will. Now, in terms of how we are careful about picking things that are just comfortable, I actually don't think very much about comfort in terms of what I deem to be true. There certainly are things that are fairly uncomfortable about Christianity. And in fact, some of the promises of Christianity are uncomfortable for me because they do seem like, gee, that seems pretty nice. And so it's actually for me the inverse of I'm not tempted to believe something because it's comfortable. I'm tempted to disbelieve it because it seems too good to be true. But then you have to balance that. You say we can't always disbelieve things that sound good because sometimes they are good.
As an artist, I tend to go with the idea of a mostly inherently free will perspective. And you discussed that as a scientist, I don't want to misinterpret your words.
You're going to, intentionally or unintentionally?
Unintentionally.
Okay.
That as human beings, we are oftentimes mechanistic. Would you say that, how would you define art in relationship to that view, which is somewhat of a personal question? But.
Right, so art is a great example of this that is apart from religion and also apart from science. That, science, a purely scientific worldview, which I'm not advocating for, just so you know, it would be difficult to ascribe value to art in a purely scientific, and yet I think art has value. It has intrinsic value, and in Christianity, art has value. It has intrinsic value as human expression, and so, but I think that the value that art has is not mechanistic, and it's not how or quantifiable or predictable. That was one of the reasons. If I hadn't become a chemist, I would have become an actor, my difficulty with acting was no one could quantify why I did a bad job at acting. Whereas they could quantify why I did a bad job on the chemistry test. It was this subjective, well, that wasn't quite right, this was better, and so forth. It's because it's not mechanistically predictable. Like one person could do this and it could be great, the other person could do what seems like almost the same thing and it would not be great. But that doesn't mean that it's random. I think there are actual subjective differences. It's just hard to predict or give a set of rules or quantify. It doesn't mean it's not real.
You touched on this in your intro, but one of the questions that came up is, as a Christian, do you consider your faith more legitimate than others, and why?
Right. So I don't like the word legitimate, because of course the opposite would be saying that other faiths are illegitimate, which is certainly not the way that I go about thinking about things day to day. I think but there is an important question there about exclusivity, because part of me, I'm a people pleaser. I'd like to have the whole can't we all just get along viewpoint of things. But there is some exclusivity to Christianity, which says, that Jesus, whether you're a Christian or not, Jesus was a real person. He did exist. And he was crucified. And there is the question of how you deal with that. And either it is something that's for me, it's something that's very central and it's very important. Or if Jesus was not the Son of God, then it's something that's, it's sad that one person died and was crucified, but other than that, it has no greater significance. And that's a point that you have to wrestle with. And it's an either-or thing. It's not that I can sort of take that, take Jesus and then also this, and sort of put them together into a make my own religion kind of thing. I have to wrestle with what I think about that, and then based on what I think about that, that determines where I go with it. And so the exclusivity of Christianity in terms of being, I'm not going to say legitimate, but to being exclusive truth is related to that. In other words, it's not that there can't be truth in other areas or in other places, but that Christianity makes an exclusive claim about the rule of Jesus. That you can make a different claim and draw different conclusions about that, but it's such a radical claim that if you sort of take that one and say, okay, yes, I'll go with that, then it makes a big difference.
So, in the search for objective truth, if you're dealing with the question of, suppose there is a God, which religion is correct about the nature of God, do you think that any person making that choice owes it to themselves to maybe read the scriptures of most of the major religions before they decide, or can somebody justifiably choose Christianity having not read the Quran?
So, I'll say, I haven't read the whole Quran. I also have not read the entire Book of Mormon, but I have read some. And I'll say that I became a Christian without having read all of the scriptures. In Christianity, I would say that this is in part due to the fact that unlike Islam and Judaism, Christianity isn't primarily a religion of a book. It's a religion of a person. And so, even if you've never read the Bible, you can still be a perfectly good Christian. Because it's all about the person of Jesus and his relationship to people and humanity and his relationship to people through other people. So in that respect, and I think that that's actually a much more satisfying way to come to a worldview, talking to people, than reading books. Reading books are good because I think they're sort of like in our personal experience, even with all the people here in this room, we still have a fairly limited experience of what life is like. And so scriptures are much more of a documentation of a wider experience than we might otherwise have of what God or faith or things are like. So in that sense, they're good enrichment tools. But just reading the scriptures would be like, just reading your textbook and not going to class. You could potentially still pass the test, but it's not the designed way to do things. I think that people are the way that we come to our, maybe not the way we should, but that's for me the most satisfying way to come to a belief system.
Can you explain how you came to that understanding from maybe in contrast to the more historical understandings of Christianity that may have been based more out of the book as the strict way of approaching Jesus Christ or religion?
So I would say that most Christians actually, in some form, I don't know about most. Okay, there's a large Christian tradition that has the same sort of approach to Jesus that I just stated, which is to say that the Bible is very important. Scripture is very important. That there are people that would say that one of their key beliefs is that scriptures are infallible or without error. But those people would still say, well, what is the most significant thing about Christianity is, well, obviously it's not the Bible, it's Jesus. And so in that sense, there's different, well, how much more important is he? Like he's way up here and the Bible's way down here, or is it, like option 1A and 1B? And I would say that those two things, and I would say it's also like in class where, there are different ways we can learn the material. It's not like they're going to come into conflict with each other. It's not like, well, sometimes it happens that your professor contradicts the textbook, but usually that's by mistake. So, you have lectures, you have recitations, you have homework, you have projects, you have the book, you have Wikipedia, all different ways that you can learn about something. And it's not like those things contradict each other, it's just a matter of which one of those is the sort of most, there's different words, you could say, well, which is most reliable, which is most efficient, which is going to give you the deepest understanding, which is going to give you the most long-lasting impact in terms of how it's going to affect your life. I would say I came to this, this viewpoint by, I'm kind of an introvert, so I don't necessarily like hanging out with people all the time. I like to sit back and read books and so forth, but I actually read a book that talked about why it was important for Christians to come together in community and worship God together, and if they're going to read the scriptures together as opposed to locked up in their individual rooms, that this was part of worshiping God and being the body of Christ on earth, was doing these things together, as opposed to just, oh, well, I'm going to read the book and figure it out for myself.
Having this view on being an introvert, and the fact that you came to the conclusions about your faith simply on your own terms, would you say that the idea of institutional religious establishments, totally just talked myself into a circle, is deleterious to humanity as a whole?
So I would say no. So first of all, I'll say that this is an argument that gets put out a lot. And I think you get to this point by cherry picking. So you can obviously find people who claim to be Christians who were terrible people. You can also find instances of religious bodies doing terrible things. In the name, even Christian, the Roman Catholic Church during the Crusades, for example, did a lot of terrible things in the name of Christianity. And you could take those things and say, well, see, you come up with a longer list. And the reason you come up with a very long list is because there have been lots of Christians, and Christianity's been around for a long time. And so even with a very small error rate over a long period of time, there are lots of errors. So you can contrast that saying, well, you can also say, well, what about good things that came out of Judeo-Christian tradition? So that at the time that the Ten Commandments were written, they were a huge advance in terms of the moral understanding of how people should interact with each other. When early Christians came together, it was radical that they spent most of their time caring for the poor and the sick and the widows, rather than trying to court favor with the powerful. During the abolition of slavery, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, Christianity was the main driving force in the abolition movement. So there are lots of good things that Christianity has done for humanity. So I don't think that, I don't think it's accurate to say that Christianity or any other religion has been primarily deleterious or harmful to humanity. And the other reason that I don't necessarily like that, so that I'll make that that positive argument. The other thing is I just don't like that argument because it provides no plausible counterexample of saying, well, wouldn't it have been better if they hadn't done all of these things? They say, well, what would have happened if they hadn't been there? It presumes that everything would have been just peaches and lollipops if it hadn't been for the church. And I think that's this is the thing that the most disenchanting thing that happened to me during my college education was I took a class that was on critical thinking. I worked really hard. The teacher encouraged us to think critically. In the first paper, I worked really, really hard on it, and I got a B. I was like, all right, I worked hard on the next one. I got a B on the next paper. I worked hard on the next paper. I got a B on that paper. And I was like, this sucks. Because by the time I got to the final paper, it was like, I can't get an A in this class anymore. I'm going to get a B. Like, even if I got a 100% of the final paper. And so I was like, so I was just pissed off. And I read Walden Pond, and I hated the book, and I just ripped it. I was just like, oh, this is terrible. I can't believe Thoreau did this, and so forth. I got an A+ on the final paper. All the other ones I'd been positive, trying to weigh the pros and cons, the way, would be good. You know, it's like, if you just rip something, you're just totally critical of it, I got an A. And they was like, this is what I wanted you to do the whole time. I was like, well, that's lame. Because I didn't provide any alternative. I didn't say, well, here, I just said throws bad, period, end of essay. You know, I didn't say, well, and here is an alternative viewpoint that's even better. And it's really just, we've all been trained very well how to be critical and not how to provide a positive alternative to something. So that's my take on that particular question is, you know, yeah, I wouldn't agree with it, but I also would even think it's just not a very useful question because, you know, even if you found a long laundry list, you still then have to say, well, but wouldn't it have been better if we had done this?
How could you sort of discuss the differences between morality through religion and morality through secular or scientific understanding?
Right. So I should be clear that you know, some folks would also, in the same way people would say that throughout this argument, oh well, you know, religion is bad. Some people will say that atheism is bad. That you can't, you know, have a moral code. You'll just turn into a mass murderer if you become an atheist. I think that's completely false. And I'd just like to put that out there as, you know, another one of the misconceptions that we you shouldn't let anybody try to pull over on you. You certainly can have a moral code as an atheist. You can I've certainly met many moral people who are agnostics and atheists. You know, the problem for me, and you could even, in principle, through rationalism, if you wanted to arrive at the same moral code as an atheist, or as just by reasoning things out as Christians. I mean, you could make every single moral decision. Say, well, this would you could take a test of what are all the right and wrong things to do. You might test out to say exactly the same rights and wrongs as someone who's a Christian. The difficulty for me has always been has not been figuring out what the right thing to do is. The difficulty has always been doing the right thing. And by itself, rationalism or secularism doesn't provide me any wherewithal to do the right thing. It just says, well, this is the right thing. You can choose to do it or not. I remember Dallas Willard, who was taught at a school in Texas. He taught a class on ethics. And he was very struck by the fact that he had a student in his class who was working hard and then inexplicably just dropped out of class. And he contacted her and had her come into his office because he was like, why did you drop out of class? And she just broke down in tears in his office. She said, look, I'm on financial aid, and part of my work study, I clean some of the dormitories. And there's a group of guys in the dormitory that I go to, and they just harass me terribly because I'm cleaning their dorm room. And they may insult me and they make fun of me, and they are all in your class and they are all getting A's. So they all know how to answer the correct questions correctly about what is right and wrong, and they just choose not to do it. And she decided that she didn't want any part of an ethics class that was like that. And while I would like to think that I'm not a horrible, horrible person, I know that I'm not a really, really, really good person either. And the difficulty of actually doing the right thing all the time and finding the sort of wherewithal to do what I believe to be right is the challenge I feel like the Christianity answers that secularism or more rationalism wouldn't. Is that?
Yeah. Do you think that Christianity gives you the power to act in the better through the sort of social aspects of Christianity or through the private internal aspects?
Well, I think there are both. So there are the social aspects of Christianity that help, but I would say that to the extent to which they're specific to Christianity, both the social aspects and the private internal aspects are the action of, theologically, I don't know whether it's Christ or the Holy Spirit, but some action of God through us that makes us better. So to the extent to which socialization actually helps me to act better, it's because other people are being God for me. In other words, helping to hold up the mirror to let me see what I actually am doing and motivate me to do what is right. It's not just peer pressure, because peer pressure works everywhere. But the way that it's intended to work in Christianity is that we come together in groups because we each reflect a tiny piece of what God is like, and by reflecting it back to each other, then we give each other the ability to do at least more good than we would be able to do by ourselves.
Before you mentioned, when you were talking about morality, that often it is easier to just know what the right thing to do. It's harder to actually do it. So I just wanted to comment on subjectiveness of knowing what the right thing to do is? Like, where does that come from? Do you believe in objective morality? Do you believe that your morality comes specifically from religion? And if so, like, how does that affect society as a whole?
So I do believe in objective morality. And if somebody wants to follow up on that with a question, I'm happy to, but I'll just say that. But you could also come up with objective morality from different sources. So you could come up with an objective morality that comes from rationalism. You could come up with an objective morality that comes from Islam, one from Christianity, one from Judaism, one from Buddhism. So there are different ways. Actually, I don't know if you can come up with an objective. Okay. You can come up with it from different sources. One of the things that you have to admit, is that certainly in the public square is that while I think Christianity is the correct objective morality, there's no way that I can prove that Christianity, in a certain certifiable objective sense, that this is I believe there's an objective morality, but at the same time I don't believe there's an objective way to prove which objective morality is the correct objective morality, if that is sufficiently convoluted. So you have to leave room for the fact that, look, there is a debate in the public square because if we have a difference of opinion about something, I can't prove that you're wrong, and you can't prove that I'm wrong, and so we have to learn how to coexist with that.
Right. So, right. Of course, we can't prove objective morality, but how do we actually arrive at the conclusions of objective morality?
Yeah. So for me, that actually hasn't been as much of an issue. Because there's a very small fraction of the decisions I make in life where it's unclear what to do. The vast majority of decisions, it's clear what the right thing to do is. It's like that. They give the example of most of the people who are in jail for stealing don't think stealing is okay. They just think it's wrong, but they did it anyway. So I think that the vast majority of cases that I encounter, it's like, look, I know what the right thing is, I know what the wrong thing is. It's just how do I in most cases, there's nuanced things where it's like, well, how do I balance this person's feelings versus fairness for this other person? Where there's difficult decisions, and there, in the Christian tradition, there's a reliance on God to reveal the correct path. But I would also say that at that level of distinction, I'm not very confident that I always do know which way was right. And then I say, well, you offer it up and you say, well, there is forgiveness in Christianity. You say, well, I tried to do what was right. Maybe I was wrong. I'll ask for forgiveness either way.
I guess in the interest of time, we'll have one more maybe quick question, and then we'll move on to closing remarks to end the forum. So
I have kind of a follow-up question. So you're talked about objective belief in morality, and I just wanted maybe to touch on how that you can reconcile that belief with an objective morality with controversial issues such as death penalty or abortion. Things that some people might look at and say, okay, here's an example of why there's subjective morality. Some person might believe something's right in this circumstance.
Okay, so yeah, I should clarify, because I have used the words objective, subjective, and then there's another word which is relative. So when I say objective morality, it's a different use of the word objective than with respect to science. So morality, by its nature, is subjective in the sense that it influences the subject, and it has to do with my decisions. It's not just an ethics is abstract. Morality is subjective, and it influences how I should act or decide. So it's subjective. When I say objective. Objective is used both as the opposite of subjective. It's also the opposite of relative, depending on which meaning. So I was using objective in the sense of not relative. In other words, I believe that there are certain decisions that can be made that are not morally defensible by any moral creed. So that it's not just like, well, you made this decision, I made this decision. They're equally good moral decisions based on this sort of relativist argument. Whereas I would make the objectivist argument that I think there is an objective moral code. I wouldn't say that I can prove that I have it, or even that I always do know the objective right thing to do. But that even when I don't know, I still have it sort of as an article of faith, I guess, that there is a right thing to do, and it's not just, oh well, if I decide this way, it could be right for me, and if you decide this way, it could be right for you. It's just the idea that even if I don't know what it is, there is a right thing to do.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.